Good evening, friends of the Corning Museum of Glass. I'm Marv Bolt, Curator of Science and Technology here at the museum. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our special guest, Dava Sobel, our behind the glass speaker this evening. But before doing that, I have something else I'd like to do, which is to alert you to an exciting opportunity that's coming here next month. On May 12, we're unveiling the innovative recent work of 100 artists, designers, and architects who represent 32 different nationalities, each of them working in this incredible material of glass. It's called New Glass Now, and it will be on exhibition from May through January of next year. It's an impressive assembly. I've seen a few things. I'm looking forward to seeing the rest. It's been put together by my colleague, Susie Silbert. Yay! Who's curator of modern and contemporary glass, and it's put on display by our extraordinary team here at the museum. So, New Glass Now, you don't want to miss it, and you shouldn't. All right, now we return to New Glass a century or so ago. Tonight's speaker, Dava Sobel, is one of the world's foremost writers on the history of science. Her best-selling book, Longitude, demonstrated that even, let's put it this way, a dry topic, namely calculating longitude while sailing the 7 seas, even that can be a fascinating tale in the hands of a brilliant storyteller. Dava's won numerous prizes for her work, which has had an enormous impact on the discipline of the history of science. Perhaps more than anyone else, she's demonstrated the value of and the need for historians to write compelling and engaging narratives instead of all that dry, dusty stuff we used to write, or some of us used to write, and sometimes still do. Dava has also written several other histories in the best sense of that word, and these include 2 volumes on Copernicus, 1 a book and 1 a play, 2 books on Galileo and one of his daughters, and 1 on planets. And coincidentally, or actually probably not coincidentally, Dava is here this evening with her friend and fellow outstanding writer Diane Ackerman, whose first book of poetry was also on the planets. So be careful who you hang out with. In each of her books, Dava brings together 3 elements in her signature style. The first is serious scholarship that goes into archives and uncovers these incredibly interesting and difficult to find details. Second, a very sensitive portrayal of the humanity, often the fragility and the resilience of her historical characters. And third, elegant writing of a suspenseful narrative that keeps you turning those pages and saying, wow, is it really 3 in the morning already? So most recently, Dava has written The Glass Universe, How the Ladies of the Harvard Observatory Took the Measure of the Stars, and that's the topic of tonight's presentation. In The Glass Universe, she looks at an episode formerly known pretty much only to, how shall I put this, astronomically savvy, nerdy, geeky audiences, and even then, known only in its broadest details. Her examination of the narrative's complex characters replicates those characters' careful inspection of glass photographic plates. And in both instances, the details exposed reveal worlds previously hidden to our eyes. So, let's welcome Dava Sobel on The Glass Universe.
We'll have to get better from here. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I want to explain to you about the title of this book and why I seemed like such a perfect fit for this lecture series. So I thought I was being extremely clever with the title The Glass Universe, because the story is about a series of photographs on glass plates that actually captured the whole sky. And it was a unique resource that still exists today. And of course, the glass universe played a little bit on the idea of the glass ceiling. And the story is about women who were doing very important work, but never achieving the level of compensation as the men did in their working environment. So again, I thought it was frightfully clever. It even, in my mind, reminded me a little bit of the glass menagerie because of the way this group was sheltered, and some of them were fragile in one way or another. But it has turned around to bite me a little bit because it's such a play on the glass ceiling that people often call it the glass ceiling, including my publisher. So I've lived to regret how clever I was. But here are some of the ladies, and they were not extremely well educated at first. Most of them just had a high school education, but they were smart and they were interested, and they were able to learn how to do a new kind of astronomy that was made possible by glass. Astronomy is always dependent on glass for the telescopes, but this was something in addition. And just to give you a sense of what life was like for women at that time, we're talking about the 1880s. This book seems to argue in favor of education for women, but in fact, it made the opposite point. And this author claimed that if a young woman went to college, engaged in serious study at this tender age, that it would do her irreparable harm, and that, in fact, her reproductive organs would atrophy. It's nice that we can laugh at that now. And that was, in fact, the first official duty of the American Association of University Women, was to debunk that myth, which they did by interviewing women who'd been to college and discovering that they had, in fact, had children. So this was the observatory at Harvard. It was a very attractive wooden building, kind of a wholly disowned subsidiary of the university, because although it had the Harvard name, it didn't get any money from the university, but it was affiliated. And you can see there was a big telescope and a smaller telescope, and over here was the residence of the director. So he was right there, could go to work at any hour of the day or night, and his family members could be roped into the work of the observatory. And that's how the first women got to work there. So they were the wives, daughters, sisters of the astronomers. And they did really well. And the work that they were engaged in was called computing. Observatories always had computers to do the calculations. There are many calculations involved with astronomical observation. And most observatories had men doing that work. But at Harvard, a tradition started of having women in those jobs. When Edward Pickering took over as director of the observatory in 1877, there were 6 women already working there. And it was a very easy, logical step from having people within the observatory family there to hiring women from outside to do the same sort of work. Because not only was it obvious that they could do the work, they were cheaper. So this is a typical glass plate, just for those of you who've never, this is an outmoded technology in astronomy, but in the 1870s, it was the hot new thing. So most of the plates are about 8 inches by 10 inches. They have photographic emulsion on one side, and most of them like this are negatives. So the stars and galaxies appear dark, and then the background is light. And on the non-emulsion side of the glass, you can write. You can make any kind of notation, which is very handy when you're discussing a plate with other people in the observatory. You can refer to things by their numbers. The earliest pictures were sometimes grossly overexposed. Many of you will recognize the Orion constellation here. Pickering was a physicist more than an astronomer, and several people were worried that maybe he wasn't the right man for the job, because what most astronomers were doing at the time was mapping the sky. So when he brought photography into the observatory, he showed that the mapping could be done much more efficiently on photographic plates. And furthermore, because the plate could absorb light over time, which the human eye cannot do, stars would show up on the plates that were far dimmer than stars, than anything that could be seen even by the best observers with the most powerful telescopes. So this was how he demonstrated the value of photography, which a lot of people thought was just a fad that would die out. Sometimes they photographed transient phenomena. This is Halley's Comet. But again, most of the images are of stars. And one of the things Pickering wanted to do was to really study the physics of the stars, starting by trying to determine the relative brightness of every star on every image. That was something he worked on personally. He also worked on it in observations through the telescope. And his biggest, most important project got started thanks to a love story, really. This couple, Dr. Henry Draper and his wife, Anna Palmer Draper. Henry was a medical doctor, but a serious amateur astronomer. And as an amateur, he could do the interesting things at the forefront of the field. He wasn't stuck mapping the stars the way most astronomers employed by professional observatories were stuck. And he was interested in spectroscopy, the new science of splitting the star's light into its component colors and seeing what could be discovered about the stars. And one of the first things that was discovered was the identity of some of the elements in the stars, something that people had thought would never be possible, because how could we go to a star and get a sample? But with this kind of analysis, it was suddenly possible. And Henry liked to say that spectral analysis had made the chemist's arms millions of miles long. So his wife was independently wealthy, and she became his astronomy assistant. They did everything together. And he was the first person who succeeded in taking a photograph of the spectrum of a star. So an actual picture of this spreading out of the star's light. And that was so important, such a huge leap, that he decided to quit medicine, quit teaching, and devote the rest of his life to photographing the spectra of the stars and being able to create a taxonomy of the stars, a classification system based on the differences in the spectra. And so they got all their affairs in order to do that. And just when they were ready to move to their private observatory, he developed pneumonia and died at age 45. So she was heartbroken and determined to see his dream realized. She thought she might carry on the work herself. But after a couple of years, she struck a bargain with Pickering, who was a friend of theirs. And she said, if you will do this work in my husband's name, I will provide the funding. And Pickering, who was always fundraising because he got no money from the university, that was an offer he could not refuse. This is a textbook image of a spectrum. So you have the white light spread out into its colors, and then you have these dark lines that give an indication of chemical makeup. And the spectrum will also tell you something about the motion of the object, because the characteristic lines will get shifted toward the red end if the object is moving away from the observer, and toward the blue if it's moving toward us. But of course, there was no color photography yet. So the best of Henry Draper's images looked like this. This is Mrs. Draper in her formal portrait. I cannot overestimate the effect she had on the observatory. Her gift, which quickly turned into about $10,000 a year for 30 years, about tripled the operating budget of the observatory. And she stayed very closely involved. She and Pickering wrote to each other 2 or 3 times a week about what was going on, and she frequently visited. And over the 30 years, they never arrived at a first-name basis. It was always, my dear Professor Pickering, my dear Mrs. Draper. So Pickering immediately wanted to adjust Draper's technique and get hundreds of stars on a single plate to speed up the process. And so every little smudge that you see here is the spectrum of a star. This is a penny. And so this is the work he turned over to now a large staff of women. And this was the assignment. Look at these smudges and look for the patterns of lines and see if you can divide the stars into categories according to those patterns. That was it. And you may wonder how they could even see them, let alone divide them into categories, but I will explain that. So this is the first woman who took on this work in a really serious way. She was able to categorize 10,000 stars. And it's a remarkable story because she came to the observatory as a domestic servant. So she had answered an ad for a job as a second maid in the residence because although she had come to the United States from Scotland as a young bride, she soon found herself alone and pregnant and desperate. So she took this maid's job. And Pickering immediately realized how smart she was, and he moved her into the observatory and taught her how to do computing, which she was very good at. She'd been a school teacher in Scotland, and also challenged her to look at the plates and helped her go back to Scotland to have her baby. And she was so grateful to him, she named her baby Edward Charles Pickering Fleming. And he promised her a real job if she would come back, which she did. She came back after about 2 years and eventually brought her son over as well and managed to put him through MIT. And she was the first woman to hold a Harvard University title as curator of astronomical photographs. And she stayed at Harvard for the rest of her life. So this was how you could really study the plates. They were set in a wooden frame like this. She's sitting in front of a window. So this is a staged photograph. The shade is drawn. Normally, the light comes in the window, and there's a mirror at the base of the stand. And the mirror bounces the light up through the plate, so you have good, strong illumination. And then you have a magnifying glass, which is key. And then you can look at the images. And she was very practical. She gave each category a name using the letters of the alphabet. So she went about A through O. And she very quickly became the head person in charge of all the other women, in charge of hiring and firing, supervising. So when you're doing this kind of work, of course, it's really close work, and you don't want to be looking away and writing things down. So you call out your categorizations to a partner who was keeping notes in a logbook. Here's another way of examining the plates. This is a modified microscope. So they had various ways of magnifying the images. And they probably weren't crowded quite so closely together. Again, these are staged photographs. So as the plates began accumulating, Pickering became paranoid about fire. What if the observatory, which was a wooden structure, what if it caught fire and the plates were destroyed because they mounted up quickly? So he had astronomers every clear night. They were out there photographing all through the night. And he knew he was creating a priceless, invaluable resource. So he campaigned for some money and built this brick structure. It was called the Brick Building. So you see it was right next to the observatory. And all the plates got moved into this building, about 300,000 of them by the time this building went up. And they were all shot from one building to the other in crates on a pulley line. And nothing got broken, amazingly. And of course, the women who were analyzing the plates also moved into the building. Antonia Mori was the first woman who came to work in the observatory who had a college education. She had studied at Vassar with this woman. This is Mariah Mitchell, the first American woman to become world famous as an astronomer. She discovered a comet in 1847 and won a gold medal from the King of Denmark. And then Matthew Vassar chose her to teach astronomy at his new college for women. And so Antonia Mori, 8 semesters of astronomy, and she was the niece of Henry Draper. Here she is again. So when she came to the observatory, she saw Mrs. Fleming's first volume of the Henry Draper catalog, and she had a different way of going about it. She had different spectral images. They were larger, and she saw more detail. And she made up her own classification system, which was a lot more complicated than Mrs. Fleming's. So for a while, there were 2 systems at the same observatory, and other systems at other observatories, because astronomers were really eager to have this issue, this question solved, so they could have a common language to talk about the stars. Antijump Cannon also came as a college-educated woman. She was a graduate of Wellesley College, and she was able to take the best elements of Mrs. Fleming's system and Miss Mori's system and put them together, and it was so effective that it is still in use today. So to do that, she noticed that Miss Mori was really on to something about a progression of stellar types. But she liked Mrs. Fleming's letters of the alphabet. So she just juggled the alphabet to have the letters follow Miss Mori's plan. And that meant that the alphabet was no longer in alphabetical order. And you would think it'd be pretty useless that way. So a mnemonic was fashioned, which astronomy students still learn. So because they have to remember that the order of the stars is O, B, A, F, G, K, M. And the way to remember that is, O, be a fine girl or guy, kiss me. Miss Cannon had so much experience as an observer before she came that she was the first woman who was allowed to make telescope observations at Harvard. These drawings are from a wonderful little children's book about her, which is really factually accurate, which is more than I can say for some of the children's books about other women astronomers. This is a typical plate used by Jumpcannon. So you can see she went through, she numbered all the smudges. Some people cannot even see a smudge next to one of her numbers. And she used different colored inks, the better to be able to tell things apart. And then she would look at these with her partner, and she would call out a number and call out a letter within seconds. And nobody could understand how she could make those judgments so quickly, but she did. And I had a great resource in the Harvard University archives where all the materials from the observatory are preserved. So these are Annie Jumpcannon's diaries. She kept diaries her whole life. And you may be able to tell her handwriting was terrible. So that really slowed me down for a while, but I did get the hang of it. And she also saved her correspondence. And she corresponded with astronomers all over the world. They all wrote back to them, to her. And if they had children, she also wrote to the children and had her own relationship with the children. So Pickering needed to have all the stars, not just what could be seen from Cambridge. So he was intent on setting up a satellite observatory in the southern hemisphere. And this is the first Mount Harvard in Peru. It looks very ramshackle, but they got it together in a few years. It was near the town of Arequipa, Peru, in the lee of a volcano. They thought it was an extinct volcano. Turned out it was a dormant volcano, but nothing terrible happened. Several of these buildings house telescopes. They have shed-type roofs. This one is the only one that really looks like a telescope dome. And this is the instrument inside it. This was a new kind of instrument designed by Pickering, especially for the southern hemisphere. So it was strictly for taking photographs, and it took large format photographs, 14 by 17-inch glass plates. And the design of it was very complicated, and he knew it was going to be very expensive, and he put out an announcement that he needed $50,000 to build this instrument. And another heiress wrote him a check for $50,000. I think Pickering was extremely charming. And it was a good thing, too. So the heiress's name was Catherine Wolfe Bruce. I can't show you a picture of her because, as far as anyone knows, there are no portraits, no pictures. But this is the Bruce telescope. So the lenses for this were created in Paris by the foremost glass maker of the time, whose name was Mantois. And it took him, he had one problem after another, one delay after another, creating these lenses. And so Miss Bruce deputized a friend of hers to go shake him up a little bit. And the friend wrote to her, and the friend said, "The trouble in the making of the lenses seems to be the numerous accidents that occur in the firing and baking of the very best specimens, and which no human intelligence can foretell." And then he quoted the telescope maker as saying, you see, because he wasn't going to get paid until the lenses were delivered. You see, I am as interested as anyone in the completion of the work, for I am not paid anything till it is all finished. But I can only send that which is perfectly satisfactory. Besides, I am constantly in a great state of anxiety as to the baking of the molds. I have tubes connected with my bed to warn me at night if the fires are cooling, and the falling asleep of one of the watchmen may cost me no end of trouble and expense. So next time you look at the mirror blank for the Palomar telescope in the Corning Glass Museum, think of poor Monsieur Mantois. So the pictures taken in South America were all shipped back to Cambridge for analysis by the crew. And sometimes the astronomers in South America thought that really wasn't fair. They wanted a chance to look at the plates and see if they'd caught anything novel or particularly interesting. So there was a little tension for a while, back and forth. But here's Pickering, here's the brick building, and this is Antijump maturing with the project. And people didn't leave these jobs. The women just, this is the woman who was sitting at the microscope in the earlier picture. She's gone as gray as I am, and she's still at it. They just, they really loved their work. Henrietta Leavitt was the first name I learned in this group of women. And I learned it from astronomer Wendy Friedman, who was in charge of a Hubble telescope key project. So one of the most important projects that the telescope had been designed for. And it involved determining the expansion rate of the universe. And when I interviewed her, she told me that they were using a distance scale that had been started by a woman who lived more than 100 years ago, named Henrietta Swan Leavitt. Well, I thought that was absolutely remarkable, and I'd never heard of her. And when I looked into the story of Miss Leavitt, turned out she'd been working in this room full of women at Harvard, which seemed even more remarkable, because Harvard has never been a place that was particularly favorable for women. So that's what got me interested in the story. And Miss Leavitt was not working on the stellar spectral classification. Her job was to study the relative brightness of the stars. That's what she was doing. And she did that with these instruments. These are called fly spankers. They have an obvious resemblance to a fly swatter, but they are very small. So this part is only a couple of inches. And that was her joke, that they were too small to do a fly much damage. So each one of these spankers has in it a piece of a glass plate where the brightness of the stars has already been determined by an expert. So it's a key. And you move this over a new plate, and that helps you arrive at your brightness determinations of all the stars in the plate you're looking at. So this is a typical plate studied by Henrietta Leavitt. And this is an object that is visible only from the southern hemisphere. It's called the Small Magellanic Cloud. And one thing you can do, if you measure the brightness of all these stars, and then you photograph this area repeatedly over time and measure the brightness each time, you discover that some of the stars change their brightness. And variable stars was a huge interest at the observatory because people didn't understand yet why that would happen. Why would a star's brightness change over time? And when Pickering took over at Harvard, maybe 200 variable stars were known. Miss Leavitt discovered about 1,000 of them in this object alone. And she noticed something very interesting about the pattern of change and was able to reason that since these stars were all affiliated with one another. They were grouped together. They were all roughly the same distance from the Earth, so that things that looked brighter really were brighter. And because most of the time, if you look up at the stars, how do you know if something is bright because it's extremely bright but far away, or not so bright but really close? She figured a way to tell the difference from the variable stars in this object. And it was the first long-distance distance scale for measuring distances across space, and it is still in use today. So here are Miss Cannon and Miss Leavitt together, and they received worldwide recognition for their work. They were both members of the American Astronomical Society, the professional organization. Miss Cannon was an officer, and they were honorary members of foreign astronomical societies. Miss Cannon was named by the League of Women Voters as one of the 12 most important women in America. And Miss Leavitt's work got her considered for a Nobel Prize. But unfortunately, she died rather young of cancer, and the person who was so interested in her work didn't know that she had died when he thought to nominate her, because the Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously. This is one of my favorite pictures of the group. This is called the paper doll photograph for obvious reasons. And so here is, this is Miss Leavitt. This is Miss Cannon. Some of the men got in on the action here. It was not meant to be demeaning. And you can see some fresh, young faces in here. And the young women came through a wonderful series of coincidences. People were very interested in the number of women working at Harvard. And some of Mariah Mitchell's relatives on Nantucket wanted a kind of exchange with the Harvard women. They wanted someone to come teach astronomy on the island in the summer, but then be working at Harvard on research the rest of the year. And they provided a scholarship fund for these young women. And it was such a successful program that there were several scholarships. So these were more female philanthropists providing money for the observatory to bring in more women who could be trained, who could teach at Nantucket, but then also go work at other observatories. And it had the effect of infiltrating observatories with trained women. And when Pickering died and his replacement, Harlow Shapley, took over at the observatory, he wanted to create a graduate program in astronomy. He felt the observatory was not training the next generation of astronomers, which it wasn't. It was producing information, knowledge, but it wasn't training people. And so he decided to institute a graduate level program, and that he would take these Pickering scholarships for women and turn them into graduate student scholarships. But he had to honor the fact that they were women's scholarships. So he recruited the first graduate students from the women's colleges. Whoops. So this was Adelaide Ames from Vassar, and Helen Sawyer from Mount Holyoke. And this is Cecilia Payne, who came from Newnham College at Cambridge in England, where she had been told she had no real future as an astronomer. And she had read papers by the Harvard women, and she had studied atomic theory. And she had an idea for a project that required the glass plates. So Harvard looked mighty appealing to her. And Shapley helped her get one of the Pickering fellowships. And she came to Harvard and did her project. and became the first Harvard PhD in astronomy in 1925. And her project involved trying to figure out the relative abundances of the different elements in the stars. Because the elements were, for the most part, familiar elements. And people thought that the abundances would be similar. But in the program she worked out, she kept coming up with a figure for hydrogen as being about 1 million times more abundant than anything else, which seemed ridiculous. And Shapley was really worried that she would embarrass herself. And he advised her not to make too much of that. But anyway, within 4 years, the entire astronomical community, people, other more experienced people, took up the study and said, you know what, it really is mostly hydrogen. So that was pretty good for a dissertation. Wasn't all drudgery at the observatory. They had a lot of fun. Here they are in a production of the observatory Pinafore with Miss Payne in the leading role. She had a wonderful singing voice. Astronomers are often very musically talented. This is historically true. Galileo was a musician, and he was not the only one. Kepler was musical. The Herschels were musical. And she also played the violin. And she started an observatory orchestra. And there were enough musicians at the observatory to have an orchestra. So they used the music of Gilbert and Sullivan, but they made up a wacky new plot. And everybody thought it was great fun. And toward the end of Miss Cannon's life, she received an important prize for a woman scientist. And she turned that prize around. Instead of keeping it for herself, she created the Antijump Prize for a young woman in astronomy. And she thought it would be really nice if the winner, in addition to the money, if she got a memento that she would keep forever. So for each time the prize was awarded in Miss Cannon's lifetime, she commissioned a jeweler to create a little universe in gems and metals, and one of those would be given away. So this one belonged to Margaret Harwood, who was the first of the Harvard women to go work at Nantucket, and she became the director of the Nantucket Mariah Mitchell Observatory and served as director for 40 years. So there was mixed reaction to this prize. It was very popular at first, but in more recent years, women have felt, if it's a prize that's only for women, there's something second class about it. And some women actually refused it. So there was discussion what to do about it. Maybe they should open it to men. But the solution was to keep it a prize for women, but to add to the prize, they don't get the pin anymore. So to add to the prize a chance to lecture about the woman's work to a professional meeting of the American Astronomical Society. And that really makes it prestigious. It is now awarded annually, and these are some of the recent winners. It's the same young woman in both these pictures. This is Mrs. Fleming's heir. This is the current curator of astronomical photographs. Position has always been held by a woman. This one's name is Lindsey Smith Zruel, and she is here looking at the logbooks. So if you remember in the group photo where they were working together, somebody is taking notes in the logbook. They all kept careful notes of everything they did. And so all of these have been digitized now, and they're all on a crowdsourcing platform, and they're looking for people to type in what the photographs of the pages actually say to make it a searchable database. This is what I should be home doing because I can read Miss Cannon's handwriting. But there are lots of Miss Leavitt was extremely neat. You could, if you have spare time and want to get in on this, please be in touch. And this is the way the plates themselves are stored. So they're all still there at Harvard, all 500,000 of them, in the brick building, which has been expanded a couple of times. And each one is in a paper jacket because they have to be very carefully filed. They have to be instantly accessible because they're referred to often. And the paper envelope has information: which telescope was used, what was the exposure time, what were the seeing conditions, all kinds of information. And sometimes there are notes back and forth between people arguing about something seen on the plates. So it's another whole trove of information here. And the plates, although as I said, it's an outmoded technology, no astronomer takes images on glass plates anymore. But these plates are still valuable because they have never been fully analyzed. There was too much data there. So for about the past 10 years, they have been in a digitization process because that way, people who want to look at the plates won't have to come to Harvard to look at them and won't have to handle the fragile glass. In Pickering's day, if he knew you were interested in a particular set of plates, he would ship them to you. They don't do that anymore. And you can see why it would be impossible in the late 1800s, early 1900s onward to really get all the information out of an image like this. This is the southern Milky Way, and it was photographed from the station in Bloemfontein in South Africa. After about 30 years in Peru, the weather changed. Nothing else made them leave, but when they lost the weather, they packed up and moved to South Africa. So they're extremely rich images. This is the way the plate stacks, the brick building, looked on the morning of January 16th, 2016. So for all Pickering's fear of fire, he never thought about what would happen if there was a flood. So a water main burst under the building, and about 60,000 of the plates were submerged in not very clean water. And I know people in Corning are very familiar with flooding and damage, and have had the pleasure of meeting someone here who actually helped clean up after the 1972 flood. But this flood, fortunately, was discovered very quickly, and the preservation specialists on campus said, get everything out of there to someplace dry and cold. And volunteers came in, carried all 60,000 plates outside. It was January in Cambridge, it was cold, and fortunately it wasn't raining or snowing, so they could just be outside for a while to prevent mold from growing on them. And then they were all trucked to a special preservation facility where they were frozen for a while, cleaned, and almost everything has now been returned. And just very few images were destroyed. So the digitization equipment, which was, of course, completely custom built, had also been at that level and was destroyed in the flood. But the insurance money covered complete rebuilding, something faster and better. So they're kind of on schedule now, and which is good. So how many people have seen this movie? Yeah. And I like to say that the hidden figures at NASA Langley were the spiritual granddaughters of my Harvard ladies. Because why was NASA hiring women as computers? And because there was a precedent set for it. And the big difference is that these women really were computers. And when machine computers came in, they had to learn to program or they were out of a job. Whereas at Harvard, the glass plates had made them astronomers. they were able to make discoveries and really contribute in important ways. This woman is Alyssa Goodman. She is professor of astronomy at Harvard, and she is one of the people I asked to read my manuscript as a technical expert. I had 10 or 12 people do that. And my friend Doug, who is in the Doug Offenhartz, who's in the audience tonight, was also one of those readers as a, can the non-astronomer understand this book? That was his expertise. Thank you again, Doug. So Alyssa got totally sidetracked reading the manuscript because she was amazed that the women had actually been doing science. And she kind of dropped the ball on checking my astronomy because she couldn't get over it. She said, here I am at Harvard, I've heard all these people's names, but I always thought it was something cute or quaint. I didn't realize what they were doing. And it forced her to be in touch with her inner misogyny, which I think a lot of women have, because we grow up with this attitude that if a woman achieves something, maybe it wasn't that difficult to do in the first place. And it's, even with all her own achievements, she still had a little of that sense that it just hadn't been something that important. So she said, you really need to come up here and teach us our history. And so she arranged for me to have my book launch in the observatory, which was really a thrill. So from the hidden figures to the Lego figures, here's Miss Payne with the most abundant elements in the stars, and Miss Cannon with her stellar classification, and Miss Leavitt with the brightness of the stars. But Miss Leavitt's discovery, by the way, which is still in use, was for many years called the period luminosity relation. And at Harvard a few years ago, somebody said, you know, we really ought to call that the Leavitt law. So pass it on. It is catching on, the Leavitt law. Those of you who have reason to talk about such things. So this is my last slide. This is also obviously a posed photograph. So here's Cecilia Payne at the drafting table. This is Margaret Harwood, the one who became the director at Nantucket. This is Miss Morey. She's still there. She left a few times, but she always came back. Here's Miss Cannon. See, she's still working. And they're taking the picture, and she can't even look up. And still young women coming in on various kinds of scholarships, and people who have been there for 50 plus years and still happy to be at the job. So when I finished this book, a couple of people asked me what message I wanted it to send. And I always think of that line, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. I think most of you are old enough to appreciate what that means. But I wanted to tell a story, just a really ripping good story. And this book came out right around the time of the last presidential election. And for a while, I was so staggered by those events that I thought, who would want to read this story now? But then I thought, well, it's a true story. It's a true story about women in science. And I think, considering what has happened since the election, the dangerous disregard for science at the highest levels of the federal government, which I personally find terrifying. I think it behooves all of us, in whatever way we can, to keep telling true stories about science. So thank you. Thank you very much.
As always, engaging stories, fascinating narratives, and we have a few minutes for some questions. So, Chris has a microphone. We have a microphone in the back. So please wait for the microphone to arrive so that we can all hear your questions.
I know. I should have just come down.
Should have just come down here right away.
You might have a question, too. Thank you very much. That was thrilling to listen to. Do you know how many women actually passed through those doors and worked over the years?
Probably about 80.
I have 3 questions about the plates, and I think that maybe answering one, you'll answer all of them.
Okay.
One of them is, you showed a plate that's marked up, okay, and I'm wondering, when I was thinking about looking at that southern Magellan one, I was wondering, well, how could you do anything with that if is it marked? You know, if you're sort of marking as you're doing it. So, is there some kind of grid that you put on the plates
Yes.
that allows you to precisely identify a given point of light on it?
Yes, you can have a glass plate that is really a transparent sheet of graph paper and put it over your plate that you're studying.
But is that how they did it? When
They did do that some of
Okay.
the time. And some of those plates are there too, the grid plates.
And the last part is that you showed a plate that looked like it had spectra on it. You know, you see these little segments of it. Was that the spectra? And how did that spectra get on the plate?
How did the spectrum get on the plate? So the telescope has a prism. So the light comes through the objective end of the telescope. So all the spectra of the stars in the view get imaged on the plate that's down at the eyepiece end.
Oh, there's one right. Oh.
So you seem to have pursued a career in both science and writing.
Mm-hmm.
Did one prompt the other, or did they both grow at the same time?
Oh, thank you. I was very interested in science, even as a child, but I always loved to write, and I really didn't know that you could put them together. Science writing was not a designated career. When I'm 72, so people didn't talk about it much when I was growing up, and nobody advised me that way. So I was just a completely lost soul in college. I changed my major, I don't even know how many times. But then I fell into a job as a newspaper reporter the year of the first Earth Day. And so I was writing about science, and that was really fun. But even then, I didn't know it was called science writing. And then it was in Ithaca, near Cornell University News Bureau had a job for a science writer, somebody who just reported on all this scientific research going on at the university. And I met that person. And shortly after that, he got hired away to the National Science Foundation. And he said, "Why don't you apply for my job?" And I'm still doing the same thing, and I'm still enjoying it. So if you're interested in that.
How did Professor Pickering permit the ladies to take credit in formal scientific publications?
I'm so glad you asked that because I forgot to mention it. Pickering allowed all of them to publish under their own names, beginning with Miss Morey. So for Mrs. Fleming's catalog, which was the first one, it's published by the observatory, but it says in the preface that all of this work was done by Mrs. Fleming. So he always gave credit. And one of the reasons I'm glad you mentioned it is that you will often hear that, especially with Miss Leavitt, that her work was actually published by a man, and which is not true. She published her work in the annals of the observatory under her own name. But around that time, so much was happening at the observatory that Pickering instituted a series of bulletins. So when there was hot news, rather than wait a year for the annals to be published, he would issue a bulletin that he would send to the directors of observatories all over the world. And he would talk about new findings. So for some of Miss Leavitt's work, he wrote it up in one of the bulletins. But the first sentence says, Miss Leavitt has been doing something very interesting. And then he describes what it is. So even though the bulletin is signed Edward Pickering, he was hardly taking credit. And he referred to her discovery as a law. So that's one of my favorite things about him, that he was so fair. The only bad thing he did was to not pay them as much as he paid the men. And there's a lot of that going around today. So.
And with that, we should probably close the question because we have time for a book signing. Dave will be working away over there. You can purchase a book, have her sign it, and maybe ask a brief question while she's doing that. And we also have to be done early because Dave has to get back to transcribing those logbooks. So anyway, please thank her once again.